on behalf of the Department of Trade, Industry and Competition, in collaboration and partnership with TIPS, we're really pleased to welcome you here to this particular dialogue, especially because this dialogue is not just opportune, but I think you all are seeing what is globally taking place that requires us to rethink, relook, review, reframe the way we look at investment, the way we look at opportunities, pivoting, in terms of diversification of those particular investment opportunities itself. And I think part of this discussion, which brings a number of different perspectives around the room, is able to share not only what's going well for South Africa, but also where the challenges are and how we can, again, collectively resolve some of those challenges in the different roles that we play itself. I think you may have seen over the past year, there has been a number of visits that the department has undertaken, as well as a number of visits in supporting the president to be able to, again, diversify our markets, open up new markets for our manufactured value-added goods, but more importantly, also attracting investment into the country itself. And you would have seen, a number of different investments that may have been placed, a number of companies that are also continuing to increase their footprint. But the idea behind, the investment landscape is also to use those champions and to use the human resources around the room and around the country to be able to also speak on why South Africa has the competitive advantages that it does, and why it is a preferred investment destination itself. I think for the purposes of today, we're going to be hearing from a panel and from experts in the room, both from the private and the public sector, that will also allow us to be able to delve more into the detail of some of those challenges that can then shape and develop the policy landscape that may be required as key enablers for the investments that have to take place itself. Whilst coming out of a very successful B20 and G20, we've had a number of visits to countries such as the UAE, Saudi, the US, Japan, India, Switzerland, Belgium, Sweden, some of these particular countries that we visited in the last 6 months, including Turkey, Indonesia, Malaysia, and Vietnam. And all of these particular countries that have competitive advantages in some of the sectors that we are looking for investment in, but also to be able to appreciate where we have a competitive edge, both from a country perspective as well as a regional perspective, to be able to attract that investment into the country. All that notwithstanding that there are challenges that we obviously have as a country, but we do have a number of task teams that are in place to be able to collaborate and to be able to address this particular issues itself. One such initiative is Operation Vulindlela. Another such initiative is Business for South Africa. And these particular initiatives bring both the public and the private sector together to be able to address issues and challenges that are able to further unlock investment itself. As we prepare now for the Presidential Investment Conference that's going to be taking place on the 31st of March at Sandton Convention Center, we're also looking to engage with companies, again, across the different countries that want to make announcements. We are currently receiving announcements that are going to be placed for announcements at the Presidential Conference, and we urge yourselves to put companies that you may be aware of that are expanding their footprint, that are putting greenfield projects in place, and that maybe have put investments or launched investments in the last 12 months to get in touch with the Invest SA team to be able to take those conversations forward. But, I really just want to say, again, a very warm welcome to all of you that have taken the time to be with us this morning. And we certainly look forward to the conversations and the engaging, robust discussions that are going to be following to be able to, again, enhance our investment climate and reform, but also enhance the investment landscape that we want to be able to attract investment in. Thanks.
Thank you, Reshmi, and apologies for the sound hiccup at the start, but I think we're on track now. So just to welcome everyone again, thank you for coming to the session. Reshmi, thank you. Sorry, I didn't introduce you properly. It's Reshmi Raghavan from the dtic, and she's working in the investment promotion team. And as you heard, is trying to be part of this broader initiative that's trying to grow our investment. We heard from the Minister of Finance yesterday on the priorities of investment for the country. We've had very lackluster growth. We've fixed some of the fundamentals, but without getting that growth aligned, we're not going to see our economy achieving what we could potentially achieve, and also not getting the kind of jobs that we need. Ipileng, can you just show that one slide? Thanks. So just the context for the seminar. We've got all the ingredients for successful economic development, but we haven't had the growth rates, we haven't had the investment rates that are needed in order to achieve those goals. So just a quick slide, and I'm assuming people online can also see it, just on where we at. And this one slide captures much of the problem and why we are here today to think more critically about how we're going to get this right. So we can see, this is from the Reserve Bank data. We can see the top slide, the top line is private business. I can point with the pointer. And we had a steady, although a few dips up to COVID, and we had the big COVID dip and not really recovering out of COVID. So we haven't seen the investment rates pick up in the private sector. We've seen from the side of the state, good growth up until the mid-2010s, and then it just falls. And then only in the last year do we see that picking up again. So we heard from the Minister of Finance yesterday, investment in infrastructure is a priority, and has to be a lead sector that's going to drive economic growth. But there's other ways that the state invests in infrastructure or in the economy through the SOCs and through a number of initiatives, for example, what dtic does to support companies and other departments issuing licensing and driving growth in many different ways. So that investment from the side of the state is critical, but we do need the private sector to come in. And I think that's where some of the key issues for discussion will come through today. We've heard from Reshmi that we're going to have the investment conference at the end of March. And these are initiatives by the President and the dtic to try and spearhead and strengthen the investment climate and galvanize that investment that is much needed. You can stop showing the slide. Thank you. So we're going to have some quite nice discussion. We've got a great panel. We've got our first speaker is Dene Govender, who's an economist at TIPS. He works on the TIPS FDI tracker, and he's going to share some of the insights. The FDI tracker, as he'll explain, is available on the TIPS website. It's free for anyone who wants to use it. And what we do is we see what's happening in terms of investment in the country. So he'll give some insights on that. And then after him, we'll hear from Dr. Alistair Reiters, who's the President's Special Advisor. Dene.
Okay, so as introduced, I'm Dene Govender, TIPS economist, and I work on the FDI tracker alongside one of my colleagues who I'll mention a little bit later in the presentation. And today I'll be presenting some insights from the FDI tracker, looking at the period specifically from the first quarter of 2024 until the third quarter of 2025. Does this work? Oh, great. Okay, so just for some background, as Dr. Saul Levine mentioned, the FDI Tracker is a quarterly TIPS publication which traces the foreign direct investment announcements that are made in South Africa every quarter based on publicly available and published data. Now, we take this data and synthesize it into a database, and it's categorized across several variables. And those variables include investment values, the number of jobs created, the identity of the investor, the country of origin, the proposed location, among other variables. But it's important to note that due to the sensitivity of some private investment data, all variables can't be publicly accessed. And when this is the case, the absence of data and the assumptions are noted. So in addition to the analysis of publicly available investment data, we also take stock of challenges investors face. We note progress on previously recorded announcements, and we analyze some metrics of investment, including data from the South African Reserve Bank, the ABSA Purchasing Managers Index, and StatsSA's gross fixed capital formation data. And all of this is done with a major input from Kelelo Mashiane, who collects, collates, and analyzes most of the data that goes into the report. Okay, so for this presentation, we'll be looking at the number of projects by sector over the period that I mentioned, and this will include the announced value, the jobs created, and the types of investment. Note that I say announced value because some of these investments, they're announcements. They're investments that are going to take place, have already taken place, or are currently taking place. And sometimes the investments don't materialize in the way it was initially announced. So we call it announced value. We'll look at the number of jobs created as well as the types of investments. We'll then take stock of the projects by country of origin and their location, as well as the market which the projects seek to target. We'll then have a look at some of the social development programs that are associated with the investments, and then just take stock of a few challenges that we've picked up in the tracker that investors face. So looking at the number of projects by sector over the period under consideration, the FDI tracker recorded 124 announced investments with a corresponding announced value of 169 billion. Now, also here, it's important to note that not every project has an associated value. Sometimes a project is announced without a value. So that total is not necessarily directly corresponding with the 124. It is actually from fewer than that. So by number of projects and by value, utilities had the most or had the largest number, specifically in renewable energy. And that's across the Renewable Energy Independent Power Producer Procurement Program, the BESIP, as well as self-generation. Services was a close second with around 40 projects announced for a sum of around 50 million rand. Announcements also indicated job creation with almost 14,000 permanent jobs and 2,000 temporary jobs. By type of investments, most announcements were greenfield in nature at 77. This was followed by expansions with 22 and upgrades at 17. Brownfield investments were the fewest at 7. Next, we look at the top 10 investor countries by number of announcements over the period from the first quarter of 2024 to the third quarter of 2025. And what we see here is that European countries featured prominently within the top 10 of announced projects. Germany led over the period with 16 announcements. However, at the time of publishing, several projects didn't have an associated value, so the value for Germany is actually among the lowest in the list. In contrast, Egypt, with only 6 recorded announced projects, had a corresponding value of almost 23 billion rand, which was in renewable energy under the various IPP programs. Investment in China is really comprised of manufacturing investments, while notable announcements from the US and the UK are in ICT. So moving on to investment by province, by number of announcements, Gauteng leads by a significant margin at around 33 projects. By value, however, the Free State leads announcements over the period at around 38 billion rand, and this was largely, again, across bid window 7 of the REAP and bid window 3 of the BESIP. Announcements for Gauteng totaling almost 19 billion rand, was spread across mining, manufacturing, renewables, and ICT. Announcements for the Western Cape are similarly spread across manufacturing, services, and utilities. Investment, in contrast, in Limpopo was across mining and renewable energy. And it's also important to note that when we take stock of the projects, or the announcements rather, some of them are for multiple locations and they're recorded accordingly. And for some, the location is not specified at all. So moving on to investment by target market, we note that most announcements were targeted at the domestic market with 70 announcements. Much of these were in utilities. Investments targeting the domestic and regional market were dominated by manufacturing and services, while mining and services contributed notably to announcements targeting the domestic, regional, and international markets. Investments focusing solely on the international market was evenly spread at one apiece between mining and services. So looking at some of the social development programs that investors commit to, we've got local content, and that's particularly around the REAP. They also commit to broad-based Black economic empowerment, including women and community ownership. Investors also commit to enterprise development, which includes support for local SMMEs and preferential procurement. And they deliver skills development programs in the form of trainings, bursaries, and technology transfers. And then just to touch on some of the challenges that we've picked up in the FDI tracker, this is just at a very high level, and they include firm level financial distress, the commercial feasibility of projects that were previously announced. Some firms also run into legal challenges, and infrastructure and security disruptions at a project level have also come up as some of the challenges that investing companies face. Thank you.
Thanks, Danae. We'll open up for questions at the end, but I think there were a few things that we do need to unpack around those challenges, because they are some of the barriers that inhibit investment or stop investment. So I think we'll need to pick up on some of that discussion. I'm also curious as to the ICT investment and data centers role in that, but you can elaborate on that in question and discussion time. I'm now going to invite Dr. Alistair Reiters to say a few words. He's the President's Special Advisor on Investment Promotion. He has a long history of working in government and was previously the Director General of the Department of Trade, Industry and Competition, as it is now. He was there from, I think, 2001 to 2005 and played a number of other roles in government over time. After Alistair, we'll then hear from Eustace, and I'll introduce him then. Alistair is joining us online from Portugal, and I'm assuming it's cold there by your jacket. Welcome, Alistair.
Thank you, Saul. Good morning, everyone, and thank you for the invitation to speak today. I don't have a lot of time, so I'm going to get straight into the meat of the subject. So let me start by saying investment facilitation falls squarely within the mandate of dtic. And since 1994, there have been various institutional structures that have taken on this responsibility, both within DTIC, or DTI as it was called then, and then outside of DTI. And today we have Invest South Africa as the apex body responsible for investment promotion in South Africa. They are supported, and sometimes one could say they are in competition with provincial agencies. And more recently, we've seen, apart from the 9 provincial investment agencies that are engaged in investment promotion, we've also seen investment agencies set up at the metro level. And now we have increasingly more municipal level agencies as well. So we have a multitude of organizations within government, semi-government, NGO type, NPO type structures, all responsible for investment promotion in South Africa. But one could then also argue that investment promotion is a core responsibility. And then we have something called investment facilitation. And in a way, both of those, all of the above, are trying to do a bit of both. And in some ways, we see that investment promotion and investment facilitation appear to be, to use a term that is now often used in government, the responsibility of the whole of government. But then there are gaps that emerge as you begin to look at this architecture. And largely because of funding issues, capacity issues. And so more recently, we've seen structures like Brand South Africa, who actually do not have a mandate to do investment promotion, but in the absence of dtic capacity and sometimes resources, they fill the gap. And so more recently, Brand South Africa has taken responsibility for doing investment work on many of the overseas trips, overseas missions, investment missions, as well as large functions like the World Economic Forum. And then in addition to that, we had for a long time, up until I think 2021, 2022, we had foreign representatives that were also responsible for doing investment facilitation, but that structure was removed. And that left a big gap. And that gap was then filled by DIRCO, who came in and started to take on more responsibility for investment promotion, investment facilitation. Alongside that, you had other government departments like Home Affairs, and more increasingly agriculture, transport, energy, DMR, and fisheries and forestry and energy also playing a bigger role in investment promotion. And so alongside all of these institutions that were now doing investment promotion, investment facilitation, in the last few years, we've had 5 investment conferences. We've had smaller investment conferences taking place at the provincial level. And we've seen that the bulk of our investment over the last, I think the earlier presentation reflected that the bulk of our investments have gone into energy. So that was the situation that I encountered in May 2025 when I was appointed by the president. And the main responsibility at the time was to try and make sense of this investment architecture and try and see whether there were alternative structures that we could deploy that could generate a clearer message about what South Africa's competitive advantage is currently, or alternatively, why would someone invest in South Africa, and why would someone invest in South Africa now? So that was the mandate, but very soon, and started out with a number of engagements across the country with various institutions at the provincial level, with dtic, with Brand South Africa, trying to make sense of it. But within a month or two, the focus shifted completely away from institutional remodeling and institutional review to 3 different or 4 different areas that suddenly emerged as critical. And let me start out with the one that I have last on my list, and that is distressed industries. Since last year, we were confronted with investors who had made investments in South Africa, who are now beginning to declare distress, to declare their intentions to either wind down their business completely or change their operations from manufacturing to a warehousing operation. So the bulk of the work in the presidency ended up being focusing on distressed firms. And those range from steel to ferrochrome, to cement, to paper, and as all of you are aware, sugar. All of those industries suddenly came into sharp relief as we struggle to understand how to save jobs, rather than how to promote investment. And it started a discussion in the presidency around what are the common denominators, what are the common issues that seem to be driving many of these issues. And I'm going to touch on a few of them because it touches on Saul's last point about the challenges. And one of the things we started to see was that at one level, we were talking about diversification of our markets and continuing to grow our exports, but we were not doing sufficient enough to defend our own market. And many investors invest in a market on the basis that there are certain, let's say, safeguards, rules around tariffs, rules around excise duties and so forth. And when those things begin to change, it starts to change the economics and the commercial viability of the investment itself. And so a lot of the complaints that we're receiving are around specifically those issues. So the question was, where should the focus be? And this is the second point I'd like to raise here. Where's the focus? Is the focus on, the institutions that we started out right out in May when we started to say, let's remodel the investment architecture. The question now became, what really needs remodeling? Is it investment architecture that needs remodeling? Or is it those, or perhaps is the question not how we should be looking at the efficiency and competency and the resources that we apply to organizations that are responsible for what we would call the microeconomics in our economy? So the shift from our side is now on ITAC, is now on the Competition Commission, is now on SABS. The organizations that ensure that the economy functions, that investors who choose to locate in South Africa have the opportunity to enjoy the protections that were part of their initial assumptions. So things like the illicit economy and so forth become important, and working very closely with SARS becomes very important in terms of ensuring how we protect our borders, how we deal with issues around the border management and so forth. So the shift initially, as I say, and I'm probably repeating myself here, was initially to focus on those institutions responsible for investment promotion and facilitation. It is now shifted to entirely to the institutions that are responsible for administering our economy. And then a new area started to emerge, and that was around trade policy. We also started, as we interacted with investors, started to understand that many of them, and this is something that we promote South Africa as the gateway to Africa. But in fact, many of our investors in South Africa not only use South Africa as a gateway to Africa, but also take advantage of some of the trade agreements that we have with major economies like the US and with the EU. So for instance, the EU Free Trade Agreement is an important part of anyone's consideration when they begin to look at South Africa as a market for investment. Because using the example of autos, you manufacture cars in South Africa, but you only export, you only can sell around about 40% into your local market, and the balance is exported. And there are many examples of companies that have set up and invested in South Africa specifically to take advantage of, for instance, the now AGOA that we have, which is, I'll put that in brackets for the moment. But that was one of the reasons that Mercedes-Benz, created a customized plant that would focus entirely on the US market. So all of those assumptions, if they're not maintained over a period of time, begin to undermine the investors' initial assumptions and generate the distress that we see. But not only does that distress create anxieties for us because of the loss of jobs and the loss of economic opportunity, it also sends a very negative message to anyone else who wants to invest in South Africa when you don't have the ability to maintain your basic economic administration. So we started to look, again, to repeat, we started to look at institutional reviews of economic administration. We're looking at trade policy. And then the last two issues, being cognizant of time, was sectoral interventions and economic diplomacy. As we started to look at some of these industries in distress, we also started to ask questions about our specific sectoral policies for those sectors. And so to give you a few examples, we started looking very closely at pharmaceuticals and trying to understand what some of the impediments were there to generate greater levels of local manufacturing and greater investment in local manufacturing. We started to work very closely in the last few months with the auto industry and OEMs, with NUMSA, and with the auto component manufacturers to try and understand what exactly were the obstacles there to bring in more OEMs into South Africa. The challenge there was, what is preventing a new set of OEMs coming to South Africa in order to ensure that our component manufacturers continue to grow, because that's actually where most of the jobs are maintained and created in the auto sector. We looked at cement and what was going on in the cement industry. And in each case, it's really been, from the president's side, an opportunity to work closely with those sectors and to try and understand what the issues are, and then to work specifically with those departments or those institutions that are responsible for economic administration. And then lastly was economic diplomacy. And last year, for the first time, from about June, I think Rashid has already made mention of it, the president went on several visits, and he changed his agenda substantially from what he had previously done on all of those visits. On each visit, whether it was a state visit, whether it was just a bilateral visit, alternatively going to, let's say, New York, to UNGA, to do a multilateral engagement, we met at least 8 to 10 companies, large companies who either had investments in South Africa or companies we had specifically targeted to invest in South Africa. And that started to raise questions around economic diplomacy. What's the role of our embassies? Do we have the right people in our embassies? And do we need more of DTI in each of the embassies? And I think the results are clear. This year, we'll probably see a redeployment of people back into embassies from DTIC. But the question still remains, what is economic diplomacy for South Africa? And how is that applied either on the African continent or in our major markets? So that's something that we squarely focused on. So to conclude, the question again is, what is our competitive advantage? What is it that we want to sell to the world? and to ensure that South Africa remains an attractive investment advantage. There's a recognition that our endowments that we enjoyed in the 90s, in the 2000s, are no longer the same endowments that we used to sell energy and cheap energy as one of the most attractive investment propositions for South Africa in the 90s and 2000s. That proposition no longer holds. So what is it that we're selling as our investment endowment or our advantage? And so that question is still something that we're asking, and we're trying to find an answer to, so that we're clear about having a uniform investment message that goes out to the world. And then the last thing I'd like to end off with is to say is that in dealing with the 5 issues that I spoke about, which is economic diplomacy, sectoral interventions, trade policy, institutional reviews, looking at the administration of government and government economic agencies, and then looking specifically at the stressed industries, fundamentally what we're saying is the only way to do this is to get the basics right. We need to get departments to be capacitated with the right people. We need to get resources in the right places. And we need to get efficiencies up in our economic departments. And that's the only way we're going to encourage more investment into South Africa. Apart from all of the other efforts that are being made by both national agencies, provincial agencies, and those at the local government level. And one last thing I forgot to mention, talking about local government, by far one of the biggest issues that investors face, and something that we're now paying attention to, is just dealing with the local issues of land use licenses, billing issues, particularly in Johannesburg, water billing, effluent billing issues that have been unresolved for 10 years, overbilling. Those are issues that increasingly are now beginning to come to the presidency for resolution. And so, yes, those are part of what I would call getting the basics right and ensuring that we both attract and maintain investment. Thank you very much, all.
Thanks very much, Alistair. I think that gives us a lot of very important insights and clear direction on what the presidency is focusing on, and the collaboration that needs to happen across state institutions and government in order to have a very successful investment promotion drive and support investment facilitation. I'm sure there'll be questions for you later on. We're now going to take Eustace Mashimbai, who is the CEO of Proudly South African. He's been at Proudly South African for 20 years, and the last 10 being, it's a long time, the last 10 he's been the CEO. And he also serves on a number of boards and has some quite important insights on the role of Proudly South African in trying to drive investment and working with the company. So let's hear from Eustace, and then after him we'll take Niva Makhetla. Thanks.
Good morning, Dumelang. Okay, thank you, sir. Thank you. I think the 2 presentations before mine are very insightful, and I think it's a good build-up in terms of what the role of Proudly South African is in that space. But I thought before I even get into what Proudly South African's role is in terms of driving investment, maybe what I should do is maybe just introduce Proudly South African. People know the logo, but I don't want to assume that they know what it stands for and what it means for us as a country. So for the country's buy local campaign, and the role of Proudly South African is to ensure that if there's anyone making a purchasing decision out there, they choose a locally made product. And it was formed through NEDLAC. In 1998, there was a job summit that was convened, and at the time, the intention was to find solutions and identify solutions that would help deal with the growing unemployment problem. And one of the outcomes was to form a buy local campaign. And this is what we represent. We represent companies who go through a vetting process, and the things that we check them for are to make sure that, the products that they make have local content. And I'm glad that in your presentation, tips in terms of the FDI tech, there was mention of local content being one of the commitments being made by those who invest in the country, because that's what we're looking for. looking for people who will bring money into the country, but over and above making money themselves, look at their value chains and say, where are my raw materials coming from? Where are the components that I require to make my products coming from? And can I buy those locally? And in that way, they're also contributing, to the growth, not only of their own business, but in their own industry, but other industries that are part of that value chain. So that is what we look out for as PolySouthCan. Companies that affiliate with us are checked to ensure that the products that they're going to take into the market have sufficient local content. The second thing is that we look at the quality. They have to comply with the quality standards set out for that industry. And companies that affiliate with us have to ensure that they help us preserve the environment. How are they helping reduce the carbon footprint in the country? And lastly, do they comply with the labor legislation of the country? This phenomenon of buying local is not unique to South Africa. It's a global phenomenon. It's unique. It's not unique to us, and it's found in all over the world. You have buy local campaigns that exist for different countries. In fact, the PolySouthCan campaign was modeled around the Australian-made campaign back in 1998 when the decision was taken to form PolySouthCan. A lot of buy local campaign models were looked at in the world, and the one that was chosen was the Australian-made campaign. Obviously, we've evolved over the years and we've sort of tailored it to suit our environment. But at the time, that is what we looked at. And that Australian-made campaign is still going strong. When Australians buy, they look out for the kangaroo logo on the products. And they know that when they buy that product, they're supporting their own economy. In the US and in the UK, in the Philippines, there are campaigns like that. And even on the African continent, we, as PolySouthCan, has helped set up a lot of buy local campaigns for Zambia, Swaziland, Malawi, Zimbabwe, and even Mauritius. I want to quickly talk about the US as a case study. I don't want to talk too much about geopolitics at the moment, but I just want to show, if you look at the bullet points that I have, as far back as 1933, the US established the Buy America Act, Buy American Act, and followed that up with the Buy America Act in 1982, and issued an improvement to that act in 2017. So as much as we are seeing a lot of noise being made around the current Trump administration, even during Biden's time, when he had a briefing, his first briefing to the Joint Houses in April 2021, one of the first provisions that he signed within the first week of coming into office was around supporting that which is made in the US. So it's not unique to South Africa. Clearly, it's one of those tools that are utilized not only to grow economies, but to drive investment. Because if you invest in any economy, you invest on the back of demand that should exist, because then that there will be uptake. And I think that's why I like your slides, because they show that energy is one of the areas that people are investing in, but manufacturing as well is one of those, because there's demand for energy. There's clear demand for energy, and that's why people are seeing the need to invest. So I want to quickly talk about the value chains that I spoke about. I thought an industry that I can quickly touch on just to give you a sense before I get into some of the stuff that I really want to focus on is look at the furniture industry. I mean, just to show that if there's no demand, you will lose the investment. In 1999, we had 3,500 factories that used to make furniture in South Africa. Over a 20-year period, that was reduced to 1,100 factories. So look at all of that investment that was lost. People had invested in businesses on the back of demand that existed in South Africa, but because we chose to continue importing furniture, I mean, think of any business, whether small or big, there is a furniture item or furniture items in those businesses. So it's not that there is no buying of furniture that happens in the country, but where is the furniture coming from? And so if these people were investors, that's probably what Saul spoke about. Those are the people who've packed up and left. And so that has an impact on jobs. 50,000 jobs, direct jobs, used to be created by the furniture industry in 1999, 2000. But over that 20-year period leading up to 2020, you then only had half of those jobs, 25,000 jobs. But if you go back to my example of value chains that I mentioned earlier on, to manufacture, a furniture item, you need raw materials and components. And so the benefit accrues to other industries. Some of the industries that benefit includes the plastics industry, which supplies the synthetic fibers that are utilized in turn by the textile industry. The same goes for the natural fibers, hides and skins that are converted into leather and other textile items. They come from the agricultural industry. To make furniture, you need metal parts, which come from the metal industry. So those are just examples of industries that also benefit just from the direct investment where there's uptake and where the value chains are entrenched in South Africa. You are going to have direct contribution. So jobs are not only lost in the furniture industry directly, but the impact was also seen in other industries. So these are some of the benefits of localization as we know it. If you go and you buy local, you contribute to the retention of jobs in those industries, to the creation of jobs, to development of skills by those who then ultimately get employed in those businesses. But the most important one is it contributes to growing investment, based on domestic markets, because localization is really about saying who is buying within the borders of South Africa. And if they're buying and I'm an investor and I invest in that economy, will I, get the support I require to justify me being in that market? So this is a study that we did, I think, just to sort of, drive the point home, is that, we asked Dr. Iraja Bedian to do a study through his Pan-African Investment and Research Services, looking at the impact of investing in manufacturing. We looked at manufacturing broadly, and to say if there's a 10% increase of investing in manufacturing within South Africa, you're going to get a 13% contribution to the GDP. You're going to have 9% increase in fiscal revenue, and you're going to have 75,300 new jobs created, 8% increase in employment creation. But just like I said, in terms of value, the value chains, as much as the 10% increase will be in investment itself, you are going to have jobs, investment in manufacturing itself. You're going to have jobs created in those value chains that are sitting in mining and agricultural industry. So imagine if there was 20% increase in investment in manufacturing and 30% of what the numbers would look like, because this was just based on 10% in terms of the modeling, the SEM modeling that was utilized. And so it is critical that we think about what would drive this kind of manufacturing investment. It's consumption. No one is going to invest if no one is going to consume what they're taking to the markets. And that's why the model at South African is built the way it's built, to say things that business people and those who want to invest will look for. And that's why we like the one-stop shop model at the dtic said investors say, that you have access to information, to all other compliance mechanisms, to funding where you qualify, to ways in which you can then protect your IP and your trademarks through CIPC. But the most important is access to markets. In our view, as part of Southcan, what we have seen with the companies that we work with is that they come into the country and they invest on the back of the fact that we're saying to them, as part of Southcan, we will be your partner that will help you access markets so that you start justifying that investment, that you can then have the offtake that is required to even secure the funding where there's a need to access that funding. And the access to market programs that we have as part of Southcan talk to new entrants, people who are coming into the country for the first time, new products from those who have been in the country for a while, and even transformed entities who are helping with driving the transformation program. This is a slide that just sort of gives you a sense of how we then drive that access to market program that we have at Southcan. We focus on the public sector. Apologies. One of the fights that we've had in the public sector in terms of driving the advocacy work that we do for local procurement is with the Department of Health, as an example, where we've said, and I'm glad that I think it's Alistair who touched on the pharmaceutical industry, that we are touching on that. Think of pharmaceutical companies who invest in capacity in the country, whether it's vaccine manufacturing or even the ARV tender. We roll out the biggest ARV program in the world. And we have all of these people who have invested in the country, but yet when we issue that tender, the bulk of that tender goes to businesses who are not located in South Africa by way of their manufacturing capacity. So they just have an office here that, a commercial office with 4 or 5 people whose job is to, facilitate that they can bid for the tenders, that they can respond to those things, they can attend the briefings, But the bulk of that tender has gone to pharmaceutical companies sitting in India. So what happens to that investment? I mean, if you talk to people like Aspen, etc., they will tell you that as much as the illicit and some of those challenges are crippling their businesses, the biggest problem is they're not able to invest further, because that uptake that is supposed to come from government is not there. I mean, and the other thing that is required to drive investment in the public sector, and I'll go back to the same ARV tender example, is if you issue a tender for 3 to 5 years, it's not enough for anyone who's willing to invest to see that that they will recoup their money and make money. Because remember, people who go into business and invest are investing because there's a shareholder who wants to make money. And so what we're calling for in terms of local procurement in the public sector is that we're saying to the public sector, identify all of those programs and projects that will help drive investment. And when you issue those contracts, have localization commitments attached to it, and on the back of that, make sure that the terms and the periods for which the contracts are issued are long enough to incentivize investment to be driven into the country. So at least that's one of the responses that we would suggest we give to you, because at the end you were saying, still trying to find some of the things that will help drive investment. In our view, the public sector, the aggregated demand in the public sector is what will help drive demand. If anyone is going to come into the country and produce and invest and produce residential meters or electricity to water meters, they need to know that the aggregated demand of all municipalities, because all of them buy those meters, and those were previously designated by government. And it's a pity we've lost that designation, but that designation helped drive investment, because we started seeing a lot of businesses growing their capacity and investing more. And that's why in your slide, then you were saying it's domestic that drives the investment, and people were investing on the back of demand that exists. So public sector aggregated demand, all municipalities, all provincial government departments, all national departments will help drive demand and investment in that regard. Same for the private sector. I say I'm out of time. When source stands, it means I'm out of time. But I'll conclude with this slide. It's same as the private sector. When the private sector aggregates demand and obviously in compliance with what the Competition Commission prescribes, and they all rally behind certain sectors and they all buy local. We've seen it with the program that we run, where we call for localization commitments. Is that when they get supported in the private sector, these people who are going to supply those products are able to then invest, whether it's retailers or corporates that make that decision. There's a lot of contribution that can come from the private sector itself in terms of buying their stuff locally. Same as the general public. The general public is encouraged to look for country of origin labels and to buy stuff that is made locally. The last thing that we do as Policy South African is we focus on ensuring that those who want to buy local, rather than the public sector or the private sector, or even ordinary consumers, are able to access and find locally made products. And I just want to show you quickly something that we've established. This is one of the ways we do it. We've established an online store. So you invest in the country and you worry about where where customers will find you, whether the customers are based in South Africa or outside of South Africa. We've created an online store. It has B2C capability, it has B2B capability, and it's meant to ensure that anyone who wants to buy local knows where to go to find locally made products. But most importantly, we've started to deal with the dtic and the export branch specifically, where they will do the export development work, they will do the export promotion work. The conversations with Brand South Africa are also ongoing, and that every time they go out of the country, there will now be a reference point for referring people who want to buy products made in South Africa, for them to be able to go. And when we think this will also contribute in a big way to driving investment in the country. So let me pause here. Thank you very much. I appreciate it.
Thank you very much, Eustace. I think that gives us a lot of insight into some of the opportunities and the extensive work that's happening. I don't know what's happening with the microphone. Extensive work that's happening in trying to promote local investors, trying to promote local firms, and it acts in complement, as we can see, to the investment drive that's happening in other parts of the state. So these things are working, and we can hear from Eustace the collaborations that they are doing to try and get this right. Our next presenter is Dr. Neva Makgetla. She's a senior economist at TIPS and has published widely on the South African economy. People might see her fortnightly Business Day column, but has also published extensively for TIPS and beyond that, and worked for many years in the South African government. She's going to be sharing some research that TIPS was asked to do for the DTIC and for the presidency, looking at the investment climate. Thanks, Nipa.
I'm going to try and share my slides. Okay, so we were asked to evaluate the investment mobilization drive in 2024. That was about 5 years after the first major conference that's been talked about here already. And I think, it's important to be clear. The drive was really, there was a focus on rebuilding confidence because the period of state capture, it obviously was very unsettling for investors. And so the aim was really, as I understand it, was to rebuild confidence of private direct investors in particular. And so what we were trying to do with the paper was to see what worked and what didn't, what would be kind of the complementary measures that were required for this kind of process to work. And to that end, we first analyzed the investment trends. We then looked at business perceptions through a survey and interviews of participants in the process. And we also got interviews including with some of the people who are talking here, about how they understood the process and how they understood their role in it. And just to be clear, as you can see from the investment rates that Saul put up before, there has been a problem with investment in South Africa, particularly since the end of the commodity boom, which ended around 2011, obviously hammered by COVID. But I think what's disconcerting also, if you look, is there was a dip in 2024. And what we've really seen is that, in other words, for reasons that were largely exogenous to the process, the effort to improve investor confidence through the mobilization drive, didn't actually see a sustained increase, mostly because of COVID-19. But I think also we need to really think through what happened with load shedding in 2023. Why did it take so long to actually say this is devastating for the economy and investment? How do we address it? And I think just to underscore the issues, part of the problem is we have very slow growth compared to our peer economies. That wasn't true until pretty much after the end of the commodity boom, but also the global financial crisis. And since then, we have lagged increasingly behind other upper middle income countries, even if you take out China. And I think that's a real problem. And it's a problem for encouraging investment because growing economies, you do see growing demand without protectionism, whereas we've had to generally tended to focus on how do we protect our local demand without saying how do we grow it in the long run. What is the reason for this? Well, again, I think the investment drive was necessary. It addressed a real challenge, but wasn't sufficient. And I think we have to understand kind of what everybody's talking about. What are the measures we need in addition to building confidence? What are the actual obstacles to new investment? And just to be clear, what the survey found was that, companies did appreciate the platform. They, by the way, did not mention incentives as a major reason to invest. And in fact, the international experience, there have been studies on this elsewhere, shows that most companies make their basic investment decision and then they shop around for incentives. So it may have a marginal impact where people like auto companies can choose between countries easily. But for many other projects that are driven by local imperatives, it's going to be less important. What they saw as opportunities were both opportunities domestically, but also South Africa as a gateway to the rest of Africa. So Alistair was saying, what is our argument for why invest here? Those are the two things that came up. But they did feel that government wasn't really doing a great job in maintaining an ecosystem that was supportive for investors. Again, load shedding was just peaking at the time of the survey. And we hadn't really gotten the response underway, which has since seen it be controlled. And in fact, reduced to near zero. And I think that's an important thing to learn from, that if you delay responses to those kinds of crises, people will walk away. Also, again, they raised the issues around rail and water supply. They raised issues around delays and administrative burdens around regulatory permits and licenses. And I should say, I don't want to detract from that. But of course, if you as government go to businesses and say, what do you not like? They will raise government administration because that you're responsible for it. So it's very hard to figure out how that, not that it's unimportant, but what is its relative importance to something like load shedding? And people also raise concerns around corruption. And in the case of large construction sites, this issue of extortion gangs and sometimes community conflict. And I do think it really gave us a tips like we hadn't. I mean, this is another one where I feel like government's response has been slow. That to the extent people were doing large scale construction, particularly in relatively rural areas, this issue of gangs trying to extort them was significant. And I'm not sure that we're taking that on board enough as government. And I think really what we need to say in terms of, and I think this has come through from the earlier inputs, we need to understand why it's so hard for government to come up with consistent responses when there's a crisis, whether it's load shedding or COVID or extortion gangs. And just so you can see, these were the specific responses. There were quite a lot of unspecified in others and some that said they had no issues, but load shedding at that point was the most important response. In terms of things directly, I think Saul was saying, this issue of local government licensing in particular, the issue of visas for skilled people, and then crime and community unrest and logistics. Those were like the big issues that people raised. And I think to understand this, just to take a step back, there's different analytical levels to understand why is it so hard for our government to respond promptly when there's a crisis. Because likely what you would really like to see is an actual or potential investor, and I think this is kind of what Alistair was also saying. If they pick up the phone and tell you we have a problem, we need to be able to deal with that problem efficiently and effectively. I do think, however, that, there's different analytical levels for understanding this, and it's important to be aware of all of them. At the systemic level, at the level of how government functions, but also at the fiscal level in terms of resourcing. So the systemic level, there is actually a literature on this about the post-colonial malaise in governance. Before 94, as somebody said, South Africa sold itself on being able to maintain world-class infrastructure and the rule of law for formal businesses and as well as cheap labor. And that offset some of the other problems like, periodic uprisings. And I think the thing to bear in mind is it was possible in part because they were only providing those services to a relatively small share of the population. The question is now we have a true democracy, but we have deeply unequal economic power, and we have to balance these demands. So both the demands for improved services for households, and many of them can't pay. And so we tend to pay for them by reducing maintenance for existing systems, because you can do that for maybe 10 or 20 years, and then those systems start to fall apart. And I would argue we've seen that all over the rest of Africa. We're seeing it now in South Africa. Luckily, we have more resources to deal with it. But also, and this is where the literature is very strong, there's social and economic divides between the economic elites and the new political leadership, and that makes communication difficult. And I would argue that's why this kind of platform is important, even if it's not sufficient. So it's not a miracle solution, but ensuring that communication is open and ensuring that we have some way of responding consistently to communication around economic difficulties, even when it's people that we feel have been, historically privileged and have not contributed the way they should. I think that's important. Otherwise, what you get, which I think we've seen, is that we've had very inconsistent responses to crises in business. And we tend to be honest. We have these sort of pendulum swings where we slam business and tell them they're being, they have to look after themselves. And then when we see a problem, we go and tell them anything you want, whatever you want, and it's politically not sustainable, so we don't sustain it. And I think we need to say, how do we come up with a much more consistent approach where we can say, these are the trade-offs. This is how we are going to manage those trade-offs. And it's, just to be clear, it's not easy in a very unequal society, particularly a democracy. At the governance level, what we've seen is that economics departments and agencies, they have fragmented mandates, and coming out of this systemic problem, they're also contested. So how do you give departments a mandate and agencies, even if their core function is not necessarily economics, but to serving society in other ways, what is an appropriate prioritization of business needs? So you talk about the health department. You know, it's actually not viable to say to the departments of health, you need to pay more for medicine in order to promote the pharmaceuticals industry, because that's not their mandate. Their mandate is to provide health care. If we want to have support for the pharmaceuticals industry through the tender system, then the economics departments have to pay for the difference in price. You know, and there has to be a fund for that that's separate, because otherwise people say yes, 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 until it comes to the point where they're told you need to pay 10% more, or in some cases, 50% more for a local product. And then they say, we can't do it. And it doesn't help to ignore that price differential. We need to say whose mandate is to pay for that if it's in the name of industrialization and it's not improving healthcare directly. A particular problem is that the DTIC only directly controls tariffs, designations for local procurement, and some very limited funding. You know, the DTIC budget has plummeted over the last 20 years. And their total budget's like 11 billion, which is not, you know, of which around half goes for incentives. You know, the key levers that we talk about when we talk about a whole of government approach: infrastructure, education, and visas for skilled people and investors, licensing processes, and so on. The DTIC can only lobby other departments. They don't have any direct control over any of those. And the DTIC itself has a lot of different mandates, not only promoting investment. They're also supposed to promote Black ownership, support technological advances, expand employment, ensure equity between provinces, all of these issues. And there are trade-offs between those issues, and we don't deal with them explicitly, which of course means you end up with very distorted responses. And I would argue that, you know, there's a final problem with these mandates, which is it's not clear who's responsible when the lights go out, as with ESCOM. You know, how do we ensure, who is responsible for ensuring that businesses get the electricity they need when there's general load shedding? And it will take a few years possibly to fix that. And it took us a very long time to figure that out. And then finally, I think we shouldn't underestimate the fiscal state we're in, despite the happy budget yesterday, which is that we had a huge increase in state expenditure and consequently in debt to pay for, largely to pay for investments by Transnet and ESCOM that have not actually delivered improved services that in a visible way. In fact, because of that, that's one reason, because those investments didn't work, is one reason you have the severe problems of the last few years. But what that does mean is we don't have the resources that we had 15 years ago to improve infrastructure and some of these other services. So we need to be more efficient, and that's also a stress. So I would argue that what we need, firstly, we need more capacity at departmental level to analyze business needs and demands. We need an early warning system, so when a crisis happens, we actually take action early rather than waiting till it's a major problem for the economy. We need more access to expertise so that we can analyze demands from lobbyists, because part of the problem we have is business always comes and makes demands. We need to have the capacity easily accessible to lobby whether those demands are justified and whether the solutions they propose are sustainable politically as well as economically and socially. And that way we can come up with responses that we can defend and sustain over time. And I mean, I have to say, I think this is where organizations like TIPS are helpful, because it's easy to call on capacity. We need dispute settlement systems and mandating within government so that we don't have these enormous delays where DTIC approaches the department and says, we need you to do the following to support investors and the economy, and the other department says, no, we can't. We need some way of mediating those disputes, because everybody here who's in government knows they can go on for decades. And by the time they're resolved, it's probably irrelevant. And then finally, we need to say, how do we ensure that the departments all adhere to the priorities that are set, instead of going off after whatever they see as their immediate aim? But I do think part of that is managing mandates so that it's clear if it's outside your mandate, there has to be a negotiation. It can't just be that the economics department say to other departments, you need to spend more because we think it's good for the economy. There has to be some process to come up with the best possible solution in terms of all the mandates the government has, which are large and complex. Again, what that means is we need to say, what is the economic mandate? How do we balance that with socioeconomic demands? We need systems that can identify trade-offs and manage them coherently. And I would argue the first thing is to admit that they exist and analyze where those trade-offs are. We need to be clear about the mandates for the economics departments that are to drive economic growth, job creation, and diversify ownership. How do we manage trade-offs between those? Because there are trade-offs in terms of the costs for companies in particular. We need to be clear that it is important to grow on a competitive basis, not just by saying, subsidies and protection, but what can we actually do to cut the costs for businesses, not just of infrastructure, also of other inputs, of knowledge, of government services? How do we apply that consistently across government? And finally, what is the balance between protecting existing businesses and promoting new, more competitive activities? And it's a problem because existing businesses generally have the capacity to lobby. Potential businesses, potential investors, by definition, are not on scene. And then finally, just to be clear, this is not to say we can ignore inequality. If we want a supportive ecosystem for formal businesses, we need to address the inequalities in the system so that there's general buy-in and supporting them. And that requires things like supporting new livelihoods on a mass scale, promoting career mobility for less skilled workers, more equitable education, and also, allowing immigrants with skills to come in more easily so that we reduce the premium for skills, which in South Africa is still one of the highest in the world. Thanks.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Neva, for sharing the outcomes of that research and the recommendations that came out of it, which helped to put into context some of the earlier discussions we've had and helped us to think through some very concrete actions that need to be taken, particularly by the state in supporting economic development and investment. Our last speaker before we open up for discussion is Dr. Anthony Costa, who is currently the BUSA representative to the B20 and seconded by Nedbank. He was previously seconded to the presidency to support the presidential investment drive and has spent many years working at Nedbank or for Nedbank in other institutions. Over to you, Anthony. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Saul, and to TIPS for convening this. I think just to sort of clarify, so BUSA was the host of the B20 South Africa, the business platform for the G20, and I was there on secondment from Nedbank, as I was seconded previously to government, initially the IDC and then subsequently the presidency, and definitely not working for Nedbank, employed by them, but working for my respective employer at the time, be it BUSA or government. Just for the avoidance of any misunderstanding. And I think thank you for the speakers. I think as the CEO of Proudly South Africa pointed out, we've had some very interesting presentations. And I think in many ways, the perspectives have already provided a view from the private sector in terms of investment and what we believe from a business point of view would actually facilitate growth and investment in South Africa. So fortunately, my job is relatively easy. I think we've heard, particularly in the detailed analysis from Neva on the feedback from the investment drive, which, while it served a purpose, did raise some substantial issues, which the structure of that investment drive, the various conferences, etc., was not equipped to deal with in and of itself. But clearly the work that's subsequently been undertaken by Alistair, the team in the presidency, operations within Lela, Invest SA, etc., and dtic more generally, is working at addressing those particular constraints. In the B20, we worked with businesses from across the G20, as well as from across the African continent, with a view to saying, how can we support South Africa's G20 presidency, but from a private sector perspective? So what are the types of issues that are important to business? And we also ensured that in aligning with the G20, we took an Africa-centric perspective. So although, of course, leaving aside the individual member countries of the AU, South Africa is the only direct member of the G20, we found that there was a lot of willingness and indeed eagerness from businesses across the G20 to include this Africa focus as part of our work. And so we're quite optimistic that we are going to see, and hopefully conditions permitting, an increase in investment in Africa. And I think the story and the case is well understood. There is the demographic dividend. This is a continent which is going to have the greatest increase in population. It will have the most young people. It is the least developed continent. So just purely by virtue of those factors, this is where the opportunity remains. And it's also host to a wealth of resources. So critical minerals, namely agricultural land, and a relatively low level of development, which provides these opportunities. We looked at some of the factors that can be used to enhance this opportunity and support investment. And one of the key opportunities is the development of the African Continental Free Trade Area. So we know that intra-Africa trade is significantly lower than the comparative European or even Asian exemplar. And this would include physical reasons, the difficulties of borders, the different structure and size of the continent, certainly compared to Europe, but also the lack of alignment between systems, the difficulty of payments, inefficiencies in our customs and trade processes. So supporting the implementation of the African Continental Free Trade Area, including the Pan-African Payment Settlement System, is a significant opportunity. We've seen businesses choosing to make acquisitions and grow their manufacturing base in South Africa for purposes of exporting to the rest of the continent. I think something that the previous speakers have already touched on. And we think this is a significant opportunity and one that's likely to grow, particularly given the progress that we are seeing in this implementation. Another major focus was on access to finance. So in order to support investment and growth, you do need finance. We recognize that states are generally fiscally constrained, especially in the continent, including in South Africa, although in many respects in a better position. And you do need the private sector. So we looked at the role of DFIs. We have new leadership at the head of two of Africa's largest DFIs, Afreximbank and the African Development Bank. They've made commitments to growing infrastructure and industry on the continent. And how do we use this DFI money to leverage significantly more private sector money, which where the bulk of the funding needs to actually come from? South Africa, of course, has recently become a full member of Afreximbank. We also have other institutions and entities we work closely with, such as the Africa Finance Corporation, and from a global scale, the IFC, and all of which are looking at deploying additional resources in the continent. Probably one of the areas of greatest attention has been around the just energy transition and climate and transition finance generally. This remains a significant opportunity. We've seen here how a very well-structured government program, for example, the REAP in South Africa, about some 15 years ago, allowed for the development of this market. Of course, the first rounds of electricity were expensive, but we're now in a position where you don't require concessional capital. You can have commercial finance at significantly cheaper rates. And that was a good example of a well thought through and carefully structured state program, which regrettably was halted for several years for political reasons. And we clearly saw the impact of that in terms of dampening the rollout, as well as damaging confidence, and then also in particular damaging a local manufacturing industry, which had grown up over the years to meet the demands for solar and wind in particular, and the difficulty of restarting that. We see, in addition to critical minerals, the importance and the opportunity of infrastructure investment and manufacturing. Africa is not going to be able to develop sufficiently without an appropriate manufacturing and industrial base. South Africa has seen deindustrialization. We've understood the difficulties around tariffs and the lack of protection, as been described earlier in the meeting. How do we take advantage of some of the opportunities around supply chain diversification? So COVID, as well as the geopolitical tensions, have provided an opportunity for businesses in Africa, including in South Africa, to be able to offer themselves as supply chain alternatives to some of the concentration in Asia and elsewhere, and there is increased international interest in that. Probably, though, one of the key issues, and certainly something where we have seen some success in South Africa, and we developed a theme, was around the question of what you can sometimes call public-private partnerships or just government-business partnerships, in the sense of addressing national priorities. So in many regards, African governments are relatively poorly resourced. They don't necessarily have the capacity, either financial or in terms of human capital, to address the developmental challenges, and these sit in the private sector. How do you work with the private sector in well-governed and transparent partnerships that allow you to mobilize these resources in the national interest? In South Africa, we have seen this in addressing the energy challenge through NECOM and the partnership with business, which built on the experience with vaccine procurement during COVID, and similarly are seeing a undertaking with regard to logistics and transport, and potentially around crime and corruption as well. This is a model in which there's been a significant amount of interest from other countries. We did stress, of course, the need, though, to be aware of the potential for state capture, for corruption, and hence having to structure these types of interventions appropriately, but one certainly could not ignore them. I think finally, I just want to draw attention to the fact that there was significant willingness and indeed excitement to participate in the B20 in what was, I think we can all agree, a very challenging year from a G20 perspective. So there was a lot of uncertainty around the participation of several key G20 partners throughout the course of the year, right until the summit. But from a business perspective, this merely reinforced the desire to find platforms for engagement that actually worked. So US business, for example, we had very good support from the United States Chamber of Commerce, as well as from American-based businesses, I think, who were looking for opportunities to engage with business internationally. And we managed to not founder on any geopolitical rocks, notwithstanding the fact that as the B20, we had to work across some very different geopolitical partners. One of the key challenges that business is keen to address, I think, is the question of regulatory certainty. So we've seen this a lot with trade and tariffs. It's not a question, I think, certainly from a business perspective, there is a strong desire for tariffs to be reduced from their current levels. But more than that, the overwhelming desire is for stability and certainty in the environment, without which it's very difficult to make the kind of long-term decisions that are necessary for planning, for investment of the scale that one would want to see sustained economic growth. And if we apply that in the South African context, it refers to, it comes back to what Alistair referred to as the institutions of economic administration, and the desire there from a South African regulatory perspective to see policy consistency. So we've seen it previously with regard to visas. I think a lot of the work visa challenges have been addressed. We've seen some of the challenges around the Competition Commission. I don't think there's any reluctance to submit, of course, to a competition process, but the rules need to be clear. What are the requirements? If each transaction needs to be negotiated with a minister or a department or a commission, and it feels like there are no guidelines, many companies may simply choose to walk away rather than deal with prolonged uncertainty during which they cannot undertake any other action. Similarly, in other African countries, the inability to repatriate the proceeds from your transactions, as well as seemingly arbitrary behavior by the tax and other regulatory authorities in terms of fines and penalties, I think is something South Africa has largely avoided, but we always need to be aware of the dangers and alive to the risks. So the regulatory environment is something that can be managed, but provided it occurs within a climate of certainty. And as the international environment becomes more uncertain, countries that are able to provide a clear set of rules which are constantly enforced become increasingly attractive. Hopefully that was helpful in terms of providing a perspective, Saul, and look forward to the discussion.
Thank you very much, Anthony. Okay, we've had some very useful insights. And I mean, one of the things that I just picked up, Anthony covered a lot of ground, but one of the things that I picked up is how there have been problems, but there's been a commitment to resolving those problems. Some not immediate. I think Neva raised a whole lot of issues where we didn't respond quick enough to electricity crises, but there has been a commitment to fixing things, and that is important. And from what Alistair was saying, there's a lot that needs to be fixed. But we have seen improvement in Visa. We have seen most of the electricity issues, being resolved, although not entirely. There's still a long way to go around those. And there have been other areas that we've seen improvement in. Visas, all sorts of things that are in process of getting fixed. So part of the big takeaway for me from Anthony's input is, sure, we do have some of these challenges, and let's see how we can work together to fix some of them, because we do have some experience of getting it right. I want to open up to questions from firstly the audience and then online. If you can post them to the chat, and then Kalelo will send them to me, and then I'll read them out so that the people in the room can also hear it, and the speakers can also respond to those questions. So if you're in the room, can you raise your hand, and there will be a mic, and if you can introduce yourself. We have questions. Okay, let's start over here. 1, 2, and then, and then one at the back.
Afternoon, everybody. Hope you can hear me. Well, I can hear myself, so I'm sure you can. So I've got a few questions. First one to Danae. And I wanted to say, Danae.
Sorry, can you introduce yourself?
Oh, sorry. Usually forget that. Kanyisa from the Department of Trade. So Danae, did you look at what is the drivers for concentration of those investments in certain sectors or categories? I think one of your graphs indicated utilities had the highest numbers in that period that you outlined, and also there was more domestic versus international investments. And I just thought it would be important to understand, in order to facilitate sectoral interventions to drive those investments. And then Alistair also on sectoral interventions. Being from the dtic, I'm aware that we only have a few master plans, and yet there are quite a lot of sectors that we have. And we did have this discussion internally. Some of us asking, are we going to see master plans for all the sectors? And as we're discussing this, it came, to be realized that the capacity for implementation was not enough. And as a result, we don't have more master plans. And so I wanted to ask you, do you think that that fact that not all sectors have dedicated master plans is delaying the development necessary? I've got 2 more questions. I'm trying to be quick, but my voice is very slow. Sorry, colleagues. Eustace, I loved that, display of, for example, of the 10% investments, that if we were to do that, what could be achieved? And obviously, if we do more than that, then it becomes more. So I correlated that to Dine's presentation, and specifically my sector of interest, agriculture and agro-processing. That was really small. So what advice do you have? Because really we seem to be allowing or realizing a lot of opportunity cost because of the lack of investment to reach that 10 or 20% or even more. And I say this realizing that, and I think one of the speakers indeed confirmed that industry drives investments. And in some of the agro-processing sectors, we had quite some robust investments, and suddenly they're not coming. And that's a problem. But how do we encourage that? My last question to Mr. Costa, Anthony. I hope I got the surname right. Anthony, it sounds like, and I think that's what, gosh, I'm speaking too much. I'm forgetting names now. Saul was just saying that despite many challenges experienced, and that's what I kind of picked up from your presentation, that South African business, despite all these challenges, as an economy, we've managed to just ignore my voice. It's gonna come back. Despite all the challenges, we've leveraged the opportunities and we've remained resilient amongst the challenges, COVID and the geopolitics and all that. So following this, and I specifically, at the back of my mind, am thinking of the resistance that we're seeing currently from the biggest economy. What is South African business and of course government, what are we doing to try and counteract that resistance, to make sure that we continue to be resilient and continue leveraging those opportunities? Because I think we really have done well. Thank you.
Thanks very much.
Thank you so much.
We can have you can leave it on. Yeah, go for it. You want to introduce yourself?
Yeah, thank you. My name is Jeppe Skovhøj. I work for the Danish Embassy as an investment advisor. I got a question for Dr. Alistair Reuters. So, as we saw on Mr. Grovender's chart before, Denmark is ranking number 3 in terms of number of projects announced the last years. So we are very proud about that, and that's because Denmark, we love South Africa. The Danish companies and Danish investors, they are very keen to engage here. And that also explains the high ranking. We also know that investments is the most important GDP component to drive growth and jobs. So it is very important to raise South Africa growth. However, when we talk to our companies and investors, not just from Denmark, but also internationally and here in South Africa, they often mention BEE as a hurdle. They see it basically as a tax on investments, not just a minor one, but as a major one. And meanwhile, we have reports coming out that concluding that BEE doesn't work as intended, at least some say that, which raises the question, are there any initiative to make BEE more investor friendly or somehow address this?
Okay, thank you. There's a hand at the back there. Yeah, with the hat on. Oh, okay, that's fine. Wow. Okay, I've got a number of comments online, which I'm just going to read. So from Nicolene, who's complimenting us on the FDI tracker, saying it is truly a useful indicator that is really, as it is really difficult to keep track of projects and commitments in a data scarce environment. Thank you, Nicolene. And I'm sure Danae is appreciative of that. And Kalelo as well. I'm sure she posted it first because she also works on it. Then from Nklanipo, I hope I'm saying that properly. I think we should reflect on the impact of our inefficiencies in our ports on our economy and whether the current measures are being employed by the TNPA are sufficient. I'm not sure who wants to take that one. Then the next one is from Andre, who's saying, how do you see advantages that South Africa and Africa has in decarbonization related issues as part of country and continent strategy? And then also adds, our capital markets and investments are heavily dependent on decisions in DC in changing geopolitical world. How do you see it as it evolves? And then from Itumeleng, good day. Regarding the FDI tracker presentation, may you describe the nature of legal barriers and infrastructure security disruptions to investments, and in which project sectors are these challenges experienced? Additionally, has the strategic integrated projects designation process alleviated legal constraints to investment within infrastructure development? Thank you. Okay, so are there any other hands in the room? Otherwise, I'm just going to allow, oh, there's two here. I'm going to do 3 in the room, and then I'm going to ask each of the presenters to respond to their questions and also to give some concluding remarks. Tumela. It has to work because half the presenters are online.
I just heard a thread that was running from Dr. Reiter's presentation, and some of the issues that he raised were also raised by Niva. And to me, it sounded like it has to do with the capacity of government to actually stay in constant communication with people who are already invested in South Africa. Dr. Ritter spoke about the fact that when he started his job, the focus was on changing the institutional infrastructure or institutional makeup of investment promotion and so forth. And they quickly realized that, you know, the issue is about talking to investors who are here in South Africa and making sure that their demands or their needs are being heard by government. And I think Niva spoke about that also. So my question is whether there is work being done to make sure that, you know, that discussion or that conversation or that dialogue between investors that are in South Africa and government is improved. And if at all there is, Niva also pointed out that it's not only okay for DTI to be talking to government, but you kind of need some kind of somebody who steps in, because DTI does not always have the mandate to resolve the issues or the challenges that are facing government. How does one do that? And then my last comment would be something that Dr. Reiters raised about the fact that, you know, the capacity of government departments needs to be improved, but he referred more to the people. And I have a different take on that. I think that I worked at the DTI, and I know the DTI is a department that has got good capacity, civil servants who have worked there for a long time. But for about a period of 4 or 5 years, the department did just not have a DG, it did not have DDGs, and that is likely to affect even the more the absence of senior leadership or stable leadership. It's likely to affect the ability of any department. And as it is now, as of today, we've got a DG at the DTI, a new minister, but a lot of the DDGs or a lot of the people who are supposed to be leading different branches of the department are not in place. And DTI being such an important department, one can imagine that, you know, you cannot have good dialogue or solve the problems of the private sector without a functioning DTI. Thanks.
Thanks, Tamela. Devin?
Good afternoon, Devin Naidu from National Treasury. I would like the speakers to comment on tax policy and incentives as these relate to inward investment as well as outward investment by South African companies investing offshore. Secondly, and I'm glad my DTI colleague is behind me, the Companies Act provides that a reasonable test. If it can be shown that any company or any foreign company conducts business in South Africa as defined by a reasonable test, it is deemed to have a presence in South Africa. I would like the panel to, or the speakers to comment on this notion of offering services, products to South African population, generating revenue, but not having an office, proudly so, in South Africa. And the banks are treating these subscriptions, credit card payment, as international transactions and levying a R2 transaction fee or some similar amount. I think that's a dynamic that I would like to understand better from our eminent persons panel. Thank you.
Thank you. We'll take the last person. I think we're not going to have time for more than one more in. So just Kia can do the last one. And while she's getting the mic, just a comment from, or question from Kunlao, who's asking Neva, based on insights from the investment climate research, which specific policy or structural reforms would have the greatest short-term impact on restoring investor confidence and unlocking both domestic and foreign investment into productive sectors of the South African economy? Thanks. Here you've got the last question, and then I'll turn over to our speakers. I'm going to ask them to speak in order, just so that you've got warning that you're going to be speaking first. Yeah.
Okay, thank you. I'm Galeboha from TIPS. My question is for, I hope I'm pronouncing it correctly, but Eustace from Proudly SA. So you mentioned that the furniture industry is labor intensive and is an important industry for investment. So you also mentioned that there is a demand for furniture in any business. The demand is always there. So in terms of the constraints in terms of advancing the industry, in terms of the GVA and growing the industry, and in terms of employment and so forth, could it be that one of the constraints, well, outside of cheaper imports from other countries, is that furniture is not bought frequently due to its durability? And where do you think the demand is mostly coming from? And also, what else can be done to drive the local demand, considering the durability of the products in the industry? Like, what else can be done to drive the performance of the industry, considering that the products are not bought as frequently? Thank you.
Thanks very much. Before Danae responds, just to say that the video of this seminar will be available on the TIPS website. as well as the presentations that were given, will also be made available for those that did have presentations. Danae?
Sure. Thank you for the questions. I'll start with the drivers of concentration. Drivers for the concentration of investment, as we saw in the first graph, and then also the domestic versus regional, and there's a sort of link between the two. So we saw on the first graph investment by sector, a lot of investment in utilities, and that was really just renewable energy. And I guess, you know, we all know the driver, firstly being the government programs that have enabled investment in renewable energy, being the REAP and the BESIP, and then also the removal of the licensing requirement on self-generation, which has also seen an influx in private companies investing in things like rooftop solar. And then it then links to investment by target market, simply because there was so much investment in utilities that translated into the target market. And I mean, you get it. It's electricity for the operation in the country, not necessarily for export or anything like that. And then with regard to the legal barriers question and infrastructure, it's not to say that there are any laws that are preventing investment from taking place. It's just the nature of the thing that stopped the investment. So with regard to legal barriers, what we had come across, Kelelo and I, in the FDI tracker was, and this particularly relates to the legal barriers, is that a Philippines-based company was named as preferred bidder for the Durban Container Terminal 2 concession by Transnet, but that was challenged, which resulted in the KwaZulu-Natal High Court Division of the High Court granting an interdict against Transnet, and that just sort of halted the process. And then with regard to infrastructure, again, it's not broader infrastructure challenges. It was a specific instance where, let me just find this, where a substation that fed power to Ironfeld was vandalized, which resulted in the company having to rely on backup generators, which just proved to be unsustainable for operations. I'll leave it there. Thank you.
Thanks. So just to add to that, I mean, I think Danae's picked up on some, but these things are, we see them often. So Competition Commission outcomes or other regulatory hurdles that mean that investments don't go ahead, or other decisions that are not taken. So if you look at the history of the tracker, there are quite a few that come up over time. Alistair, your response to questions and any concluding remarks. Thanks.
Thank you, Saul. So I wanted to frame this last input by saying that the presidency is the kind of a point of last resort for many companies. And so perhaps our view of the world is slightly blinkered when it comes to many of our interactions with companies, because companies approach the presidency when either they have exhausted all their options with the department, or they've reached a point of frustration where they don't know where to go any longer. So that's normally the context in which we interface with companies, or alternatively, the second would be on the president's visits to various countries, where we have a more proactive approach to companies, because we then target companies specifically, and we have very specific requests from those companies. The president will not meet a company unless we provide him with a clear motivation for what it is we want from that specific company. And so that's very interesting, because it requires DTIC to do quite a lot of work prior to any of those visits in understanding the role of that company in terms of its strategic importance to a particular sector, or its strategic importance in a value chain. And so that has developed a very interesting set of discussions between the presidency and DTIC. Let me just quickly touch on some of the questions, and thank you for all the questions that have come through. I don't think I'm competent to answer many of them, but I'll try. I think that my interaction with some of the sectors so far, where you do have master plans, has been mixed. In some cases, there are instances where master plans are being progressed, and a lot of it depends on the chemistry between business, labor, and government. And if there's no chemistry, the master plan does not advance. A lot of the master plans sit outside of DTIC as well, so they sit in other departments other than DTIC. And then, as I've discovered recently, many of the master plans don't actually address the current problems that industries are facing. And there's a frustration that with the master plan itself and an inability to try and fix it because it seems to have been cast in stone. So whether or not having a master plan or not having a master plan assists, I can't really say because the reviews are very mixed in that regard, and I don't have sufficient insight into the details of each master plan. The question on B is very interesting because it's a question that came up very sharply in our visits to the US. And it seems that while, yes, the issue is not necessarily just about investors, the issue is also about whether BEE is the right instrument for us to ensure that we have greater access, where Black people have more access to our economy, and the benefits of BEE are distributed more widely. I think that's the fundamental question that we need to answer. From business point of view, the feedback I've got is that, yes, we need to address those issues, and we really do need to try and find a way of making it easier to comply. And why do I say easier to comply? Because many businesses have told us that in any country where you operate, you need a social license. And what they appreciate about South Africa is the fact that we have a structured engagement and we have a social license that is cast in some form of regulation or law, and it creates some level of predictability as opposed to other economies where there is no predictability around these issues. So yes, there is a review currently taking place. The president did make mention of it in his SONA speech, that there was going to be some deep thinking about how we structure BEE. But BEE is certainly part of our landscape going forward. Tumelo, nice to hear your voice again, and nice to see you on the screen. Haven't seen you for many years, but I agree with you. It's actually your points reflect a conversation that I've had with the DG at DTIC, who too has lamented about the institutional weaknesses in the structure, given the absence of leadership. And the point I wanted to make there quite strongly is that the absence of leadership is not just also had a devastating effect on the department itself. I think it's also, as I've seen now with the last Lekgotla, the cabinet Lekgotla, the functioning of clusters in government and the way that I understood the role of clusters. And here it becomes very important because we've spoken about the role of other government departments and other regulators. For instance, ICASA plays an enormous, plays an important role in creating an investment climate. NERSA plays an important role in an investment climate. And if you don't have a well-functioning DTI that leads from the front and can manage the economic cluster, then actually we suffer tremendously. And I've seen that now, and it's something I've raised in the presidency, that we really need to strengthen the clusters and the way in which the clusters work together. I think I'm going to stop there, Saul, but thank you very much for the opportunity. And unfortunately, I have to leave right now, so I won't be here for the conclusion, but thank you for everyone's questions and for the opportunity to participate. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Alistair, and thanks for joining us in this session. I'm sure we'll catch up soon. Eustace, do you want to respond?
Yeah, Kanyisa, my sister. Look, I think your question is centered around why the contribution in my research outcomes for agro-processing is minimal. Agro-processing or agricultural industry, specifically in that slide, is reflected as a contributing sector as part of the value chain. Because remember, the study focused on manufacturing itself to say when manufacturing does well, and the value chains are entrenched in the country, the agricultural industry will benefit as a source of some of the raw materials that are required. And then your question was that how can, processing be assisted to grow in the same way that the study says manufacturing can, and I think it's the same. It's investing in those value chains that are part of manufacturing, but that seek to drive the agro-processing industry. Remember, the study itself was based on manufacturing across the board. It was, and that's why my heading said manufacturing and all its subsectors. So the same thing will apply for the agro-processing industry. If there is a 10% increase in investing in manufacturing in the agro-processing space, the agricultural industry will then also benefit in that same. So it's the same principle that those who are meant to help drive up investment on the back of consumption, domestic consumption for our purposes, should actually start doing that. And in this instance, it's retailers who will lead. And then, but there's other industries. I mean, and it touches on the question that Kia asked. And we as Pilot South African have done work. It's a pity. The slide I stopped at because of time was followed by a slide which showed instances where we've been able to succeed in getting localization commitments from the private sector, where the banks, and to respond directly to you, Kia, in terms of furniture, the banks gave us a commitment. And in fact, I'll be specific, Standard Bank and ABSA were the first two banks that gave us a commitment. And that was in 2018 when we had the current president's job summit. And ABSA specifically gave us a report about 3 months ago, I think around November, which showed how much spend they have pushed towards furniture since they made that commitment. And not even one single furniture piece bought by ABSA for any of its branches or offices comes from outside of the country. So it is possible. Despite the durability that you mentioned, there's still buying that happens of furniture. That capacity was not lost because people are not buying furniture. It was lost because the furniture that is being bought, if you walk into any retail store, any furniture retail store, and look at the levels of local content versus that which is imported, you will see that it's still disproportionate. And a lot of the furniture in those stores still comes from outside of the country, except if you go into stores like Louis and the TFG one can get at home. Yes, so those ones have made deliberate local content commitments and they're driving that up. So that is what will drive up consumption. And the same then goes to agro-processing. You need those who are leading in terms of taking those products to where, they will get markets to increase levels of local content. Thanks, sir.
Thanks. Neva, your responses and any last comments?
Yeah, I think it was really interesting discussion, and I'm glad for the questions. Were also very interesting. I think really the issue we have to obviously talk about is what will help. I have to say, when we did this survey, it was in the middle of load shedding, so that was really everybody's main focus. But I think what it shows is that crises evolve and change. There will always be crises in the economy because we don't control, government simply, and society as a collective does not control much of what happens in the economy. Right now we have the tariffs, we have some issues around water. All of those things were not there at the time we did the survey. I think that's why I'm saying, to me, the critical thing is how do we ensure the government actually responds when a crisis emerges? And if we have those systems in place, the actual response will change. One thing I think is interesting is that we actually did really well during COVID. We did much better than most of our neighboring countries and much better than many countries elsewhere in the world, because it was recognized as a national crisis and there were solutions that everybody basically accepted because they were based in science. The problem with the economy is that the crisis is less apparent, especially if you're in the high income group. It's really easy not to feel like there's a crisis. And there is no real agreement until relatively recently about how do we manage, what is the solution to that crisis, given that we have to deal with the three critical problems of, deep inequalities, very high joblessness, and slow growth. And I think the risk now is there's more clarity about the need to meet the demands of business, but we also have to continue to manage the fact that many people are not benefiting from growth. And in those circumstances, they're not going to support measures that only focus on growth. So that issue of how do we get the redistribution right, I think is still critical. And we need to talk about that more. I think what we've heard a lot about here, which is true, which is a critical thing, is not just responding to the crisis, but being consistent in engagements with businesses and other stakeholders. And again, I would say that requires that we have systems in place like we have, when you put a new law or regulation into cabinet, you have to have a cost benefit analysis. We need to apply that kind of thinking more carefully across government so that we have evidence-based discussions about the costs of different measures and how we tweak them if we want, and how we manage compromises, like I was saying, for instance, between the Department of Health, which has to provide healthcare, and the DTIC and DSTI, which want to see pharmaceuticals production. We need some better understanding of the economic, but also the healthcare implications of those choices so that we can make a more reasoned decision and one that is then sustainable. And so what I would say is, everybody hates new structures, but I think we need one. I'm not sure that, despite what Alistair said, my experience of the cluster was it never had a clear mandate, and certainly not a mandate to tell departments what to do. So you ended up having disputes that would go on forever. And I mean, you would be in government, you would go out of government, you come back 10 years later, and they're still having this exact same discussions. Yeah? So I think we need a ministerial, ideally with an act that, that says what is the role of industrial policy and how do we manage, what are the core aims of industrial policy? And it should have a mandate to ensure that all the departments engage on their priorities. And if they can't help out, if ESCOM simply cannot deliver electricity to businesses, then they say that, and then the DTIC and other departments have to find some way to get those businesses offline and provide an emergency solution. That kind of thing is something I think we need to think about more. And I would argue even within the DTIC, even without an act, it is important to separate out those mandates so that because if you read the DTIC's documentation now, they have many, many different priorities which are not actually ranked, and the trade-offs are not clearly discussed. And the result is everybody goes off and pursues different priorities and piggybacks things on measures, which tends to dilute the impact. And I think we need a better way of managing that. So thanks again, and thank you for all the inputs that were very interesting.
Thank you very much, Neva. Anthony, you have the last word. If you want to open your camera and give us your concluding remarks and any responses to questions. Thanks.
Thanks, Saul. So there were just sort of two categories of questions that I think were directly applicable. The one, of course, was around South Africa's response to the United States and the political difficulties and potential economic impact in terms of the action by the current administration. So it's certainly not for me or for B20 or BUSA to speak to what government should be doing. I think what we can say is, from a business perspective, we have engaged with organized business in the United States through the US Chamber, as well as the Council for International Business, and had very positive engagements, as well as doing so with US-based companies themselves. And we certainly worked closely with the South African government during some of its activities in the United States last year, both at the World Bank meetings as well as on the sidelines of UNGA. And so we believe that an engagement directly with business, it's not up to us to talk to the administration. If we were invited to do so, we certainly would. But an engagement with US companies, we think can try and offset some of the difficulties. Of course, when it comes to tariffs and actual costs, there's nothing that we can do as business directly, except to find new markets. And certainly we have seen South African companies looking to diversify. And the plus side for that is we've also seen a lot of international businesses who would normally have exported to the United States being impacted by tariffs and other restrictions, looking for new trading partners And we've had interest from, for example, Canada, Japan, partners who wouldn't necessarily have done that much business with South Africa in doing so, both with this country and the continent as a whole. And then I think with regard to the specific questions around tax and incentives, the film incentive, I think, is a very good example, both of some of the challenges in the DTIC, as well as what happens when you remove a well-established incentive. And I think Neva is completely correct that companies do not make their primary investment decisions based on incentives. When there are existing incentives, though, that definitely feeds in, and it also is industry specific. And the film industry internationally depends heavily on incentives. And we've seen how the local industry has been impacted by the expiry of the previous scheme, the difficulties in administration, and sort of the breakdown, it would appear, of the incentive administration, which is deeply affecting the industry locally. In terms of external taxes on job creation and investment, I think the one that's very well known is around potential difficulties on ex-con relating to intellectual property and the reluctance to form businesses registered in South Africa as a result. And I think this is a long-standing issue and something that remains to be addressed. I certainly don't have any specific insight on the question of foreign companies operating in South Africa without having a local presence. But I think what it does say is we need regulation that is consistent with international practice. We need it to be well canvassed and then uniformly implemented. So yeah, once again, thanks. And I think it's been very helpful. And the fact that TIPS does provide this valuable resource deserves wider attention, as well as the need to integrate it into discussions on investment promotion and facilitation in South Africa generally.
Thank you. Thank you, Anthony. Thank you to all of our speakers online and in person, and thank you to everyone who's joined us. Apologies, we have gone slightly over, but I think the discussion was worthwhile, and it really does add a lot of value to have these insights and discussions. We will continue as TIPS to host interesting sessions and look forward to seeing you at our next event. Thanks, everyone. Good afternoon.